I was folding laundry when Vanessa hugged me from behind and said congratulations. I hadn't told anyone. Not my husband, not my mother, not even the calendar app on my phone. 2 days earlier, I had walked out of a fertility clinic with a single sheet of paper and a number I hadn't let myself believe yet. And here was my sister-in-law, standing in my own kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday, pressing her hand to my stomach like she already knew every version of the future I hadn't dared to say out loud. I asked her what she meant. She laughed, the easy laugh she always used when she thought she was being generous, and said Marcus's mother had already told the whole family. I looked at my husband, he looked at the floor. I set down the shirt I was folding, smoothed it flat on the counter, and said nothing. I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I just poured myself a glass of water and asked Vanessa if she wanted to stay for dinner, because I needed a few hours before I let anyone see what I was actually feeling. My name is Elena Marsh. I'm 34, and for 11 years I have worked as a health information privacy officer, which is a long way of saying that my entire career is built on one principle. Information about a person's body belongs to that person, and no one else gets to move it around without permission. I audit hospital systems for a living. I find the exact moment someone looked at a file they had no business opening, and I write the report that ends careers. It is quiet work. It rewards patience over instinct, and it has taught me that people who think they will never get caught are usually the ones who leave the clearest trail. I did not learn that lesson from a textbook. I learned it, eventually, from my own family. I grew up believing that dignity was something you protected by staying calm, because my mother raised 3 children alone on a hospital cafeteria salary and never once raised her voice doing it. I carried that into my marriage. When I met Marcus, he seemed like the kind of steady I had never had. An engineer, precise, someone who measured twice before he said anything at all. I married into his family knowing they were close, in a way mine never had the money to be. Sunday dinners, group chats that lit up my phone at odd hours, with photos of nothing in particular. A mother, Carol, who called every holiday personally and remembered every birthday down to the specific bakery you liked. And a sister, Vanessa, 3 years younger than Marcus, who hugged you a beat too long and complimented you a beat too specifically, so that you never quite knew if you were being admired or measured. I gave things up for that closeness, slowly enough that I didn't notice the total until years later. I moved 40 minutes farther from my own mother so we could be 15 minutes from his. I took fewer promotions than I could have, because the ones that came with relocation would have meant leaving his family's orbit, and Marcus never asked me to turn them down, not directly, but I felt the weather change every time I brought one up at dinner. I learned to time my career ambitions around his family's calendar. I told myself it was a fair trade. A family that shows up is worth something, and mine, through no fault of theirs, simply couldn't show up as often. I believed that for a long time, the way you believe in a house you've never actually inspected, because admiration and envy, I would learn, wear the exact same face at a family dinner table, and I hadn't yet learned to tell them apart. Vanessa was the clearest example of that, though it took me years to see it. She was the one who organized the group chat, who remembered to ask how my work presentation had gone, who cried, genuinely, at my wedding. She was also the one who, quietly and consistently, made sure every accomplishment of mine got mentioned in the same breath as one of hers, as though the two of us were still being measured against each other for an approval neither of us had actually asked for. If I got a promotion, she'd mention within the week that she was finally being considered for something similar at her own firm. If Marcus and I bought a house, she and her fiancé started house hunting the following month, in the same school district, on the same side of town. I used to describe it to my own mother as harmless. Sisters do this, I said, even sisters-in-law. It's just proximity. My mother, who had raised 3 daughters on her own and had a sharper eye for these things than I gave her credit for, told me once that harmless competition doesn't usually come wrapped in that much affection. I didn't understand what she meant until years later, standing in my kitchen with Vanessa's hand still warm on my stomach. There were other small things I filed away without examining, the way you file away a strange noise in a car you've decided not to worry about yet. Carol had a habit of asking Marcus questions about our finances that she never asked me directly, how the mortgage was going, whether we were saving enough, whether I was still planning on more children, as though my body's timeline were a project update she was owed. Marcus answered these questions without ever telling me they'd been asked. I only learned about most of them secondhand, months later, in passing, the way you learn a house has termites. Not from an inspection, but from a neighbor mentioning it was still on their license plate application. The pregnancy test itself had been almost an accident of timing. Marcus and I had been trying quietly, without telling anyone, because 2 years earlier, we'd lost a pregnancy at 11 weeks, and I could not survive announcing a hope out loud again before I understood whether it was real. That first loss had reshaped how Carol spoke to me, in ways I only half noticed at the time. She started asking, gently, whether I was taking care of myself, whether I traveled too much for work, whether I was under stress. I answered every question patiently, because I told myself she was grieving too, in her own way, and grief makes people say clumsy things. I didn't yet understand that grief wasn't the only thing shaping those questions. I went to the clinic alone on a Thursday morning before work. I gave blood, and the nurse told me results would post to the patient portal within 48 hours, and I drove to my office and sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes before I could make my hands stop shaking enough to drive the rest of the way in. I checked the portal that Saturday morning, alone, in the bathroom with the door locked, the way you'd check a smoke detector you already suspected was broken. Positive. I sat on the edge of the tub for a long time. I decided I would tell Marcus that night, over dinner, somewhere quiet, somewhere I could watch his face. I decided I would not tell his mother for at least 12 weeks. Not after last time. Not after the calls that came in the days after we lost the first pregnancy. Calls that were meant as comfort and landed instead, like an inventory of what I had done wrong. I had a plan. I am a person who makes plans and keeps them. The plan lasted 2 days. By Tuesday afternoon, when Vanessa wrapped her arms around me in my own kitchen, Marcus's mother had apparently known for over 24 hours. I want to describe exactly how that felt, because I think people assume betrayal like this arrives as an explosion, and it doesn't. It arrives as a very small, very cold recalibration, the kind that happens behind your eyes while your face stays perfectly still. I remember thinking, with a strange clinical detachment that I now recognize as the same instinct I use at work, someone accessed information that was mine before I chose to share it. I remember thinking, gather everything before they know you've seen it. I remember thinking that the person standing in front of me congratulating me had almost certainly not been the first stop the information made on its way to her. I asked Marcus, quietly, once Vanessa had gone home, how his mother knew. He said he didn't know. He said maybe I'd mentioned the appointment to someone, at work, on the phone, somewhere he wasn't in the room. I told him I hadn't mentioned the appointment to anyone, including him, until that exact conversation, because I hadn't wanted to say it out loud until I was sure. He didn't have an answer for that. I watched him not have an answer for a long moment, and something in me, the part of me that reviews access logs for a living, quietly opened a file. I didn't confront anyone that week. I have a rule, in my work and increasingly in my life, that you never announce an investigation before you've finished it, because the moment people know you're looking, the trail gets cleaner. So I was warm at the next family dinner. I let Carol ask about due dates I hadn't calculated yet. I let Vanessa ask if I wanted a boy or a girl, her hand resting on my arm a beat too long, her eyes a little too bright. I smiled, and I answered in generalities, and underneath the table my mind was already building a timeline. The clinic visit, the portal result, the 48 hours between my Saturday morning and Vanessa's Tuesday hug. The clinic used the same record system my own hospital network used 2 contracts ago, which meant I still had a professional contact there, a former colleague named Priya, who now ran patient records compliance. I called her, not as Elena the patient, but as Elena the auditor, and I asked her, carefully, in the language we both spoke fluently, whether she could tell me who had accessed a specific chart in a specific window. She hesitated, the way any good compliance officer hesitates when a friend asks her to bend a process. Then she told me that, as a courtesy, one professional to another, she could pull the access log herself and tell me what it showed, without putting my name anywhere near a formal request. 2 days later, she called me back. The log showed a single external access to my chart 18 hours after my results posted. Not from Carol, not from Vanessa, but from a lab technician named Renata, who I would later learn was Vanessa's fiancé's cousin, and who had, according to Priya, no clinical reason to be in that chart at all. People who think they will never get caught leave the messiest trails, and Renata's trail was almost careless. A login from a personal device, outside her assigned unit, at a time she wasn't even scheduled to work, with a session length just long enough to read the full result and nothing else. She had looked. She had told someone. That much I could prove within a week. I spent the next several days doing what I do at work, except this time, the case file had my own name on it. I built a timeline on a legal pad I kept in the bottom drawer of my nightstand, hidden the way other people hide things they're ashamed of, except I wasn't ashamed. I just didn't want anyone in that house asking why I was suddenly so interested in dates. Saturday, 9:14 a.m. Result posts to portal. Sunday, 3:40 a.m. Renata's unauthorized login, according to Priya's export. Sunday afternoon, a phone call between Renata and Vanessa's fiancé that I couldn't prove but could reasonably infer, given what came next. Monday morning, Carol calls Marcus at work, a call he later admitted to, but described, at the time, as just checking in. Tuesday, 4:50 p.m., Vanessa's hands on my stomach in my own kitchen. Laid out in a straight line like that, on paper, in my own handwriting, it stopped looking like a family being close and started looking like exactly what it was, a chain of custody. The same phrase I use in every report I write for work. Information passed from hand to hand until it reached the one person who had the least right to have it first. What I could not yet explain was why Carol had known before Marcus did, and why, when I finally sat my husband down and asked him directly whether he had said anything to anyone, his answer was no, with just enough hesitation in it that I believed him and didn't believe him at the same time. I also couldn't explain, not yet, why Carol had reacted the way she had, not with the cautious, guarded relief you'd expect from a woman worried about another loss, but with something closer to open, almost desperate joy, the kind that made Vanessa's fiancé mention, offhand, that his mother hadn't seen Carol that happy in 2 years. That detail didn't fit. A woman who was simply nosy would have been pleased. A woman who was relieved, specifically and disproportionately relieved, was a woman who had been afraid of something much bigger than missing an announcement. That detail sent me somewhere I hadn't expected to go. I started asking Marcus not about the pregnancy, but about the last time, the one we lost. For 2 years, I had privately carried the idea that his family blamed me for that loss, because of the way Carol had asked, gently but pointedly, whether I'd been taking care of myself, whether stress had played a part, whether I'd been eating enough, sleeping enough, resting enough. I had absorbed that blame, the way you absorb weather. I had never once asked to see the actual medical explanation, because grief doesn't ask questions, it just accepts whatever shape it's handed to it. It was Marcus's father, of all people, who finally told me the truth, 3 weeks into what I now understood was my own quiet investigation. He asked to meet me alone at a diner near his office on a weekday morning when Carol thought he was at a dentist appointment, and he looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally set it down on the table between us. His coffee sat untouched the entire time we talked. He told me that after our first loss, Carol had privately arranged for a specialist to review the records, worried, his word, not mine, about genetic risk on their side of the family. He said Carol had been the one to push for it, quietly, without telling either of us, because her own mother had lost 2 pregnancies decades earlier, under circumstances no one in that generation had ever properly explained, and Carol had spent 30 years wondering whether the same thing was buried somewhere in her children's blood. When the specialist confirmed it, a hereditary clotting disorder passed down clearly on Marcus's side, Carol hadn't told either of us. She told only her husband, and swore him to silence, because, he said, she couldn't stand the idea of admitting out loud that the loss might have come from her side of the family, rather than mine, after 2 years of letting the unspoken shape of blame settle quietly onto me instead. I sat with that for a long moment before I could speak. The specialist's findings, which Carol had kept to herself for 2 years rather than tell either of us, showed a hereditary clotting condition on Marcus's side, one that had contributed directly to the loss, and one that had nothing to do with anything I had or hadn't done. Not the travel, not the stress, not any of the quiet inventory I had run against myself at 3 in the morning, more times than I could count. She had let me carry the blame for her own family's history rather than say a word, and I understood then that her fast, eager congratulations to Vanessa hadn't been generosity at all. It had been relief. The relief of someone who had been quietly, anxiously monitoring whether this pregnancy would survive long enough to finally clear her own conscience, and who couldn't wait even one more day to feel that relief out loud, even if it wasn't hers to feel first. I asked Marcus's father for the specialist's name. He gave it to me without hesitation, looking almost grateful to finally be rid of it. I called the office myself the following week. The doctor confirmed the diagnosis in writing, confirmed the date Carol had received it, and confirmed, gently, that this was information that should have been shared with me directly, 2 years earlier, by anyone who had it, since it directly affected how my own pregnancies should be medically monitored going forward. I sat with that letter in my hands for a long time. I did not cry. I filed it, in the same folder where I keep Renata's access log, in the same steady handwriting I use for every case that crosses my actual desk at work. The confrontation happened without me in the room, which is, I've come to believe, how the truth often prefers to arrive, sideways, through someone else's account, so that by the time it reaches you, it has already been tested by other people's shock. It happened at Carol's 60th birthday dinner, 3 weeks after I'd spoken to the specialist. My sister-in-law's fiancé, feeling guilty after learning what his cousin Renata had done, stood up mid-dinner and told the table, in front of 20 relatives, that Renata had accessed my medical chart without authorization and passed the information to Carol. The room went silent in the particular way a room goes silent when everyone realizes at once that they've been managing a story instead of hearing one. Carol's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Vanessa's face did something complicated. Shame and defensiveness arriving at the same time, and fighting for control of her expression. My mother-in-law, who prided herself on composure the way I once had, sat perfectly still while 20 people looked at her and understood, all at once, that the family closeness they'd always admired had a much colder engine running underneath it. I heard the whole thing secondhand, from Marcus's father, who called me that night and described it slowly, like he was still processing it himself. The silence, the way Carol's hands had trembled around her water glass, the way Vanessa had left the table before dessert and hadn't answered her phone since. I listened without saying much. I already knew the parts he was telling me. I just hadn't known they'd finally be said out loud, in that room, in front of the people who'd spent 2 years quietly deciding what I deserved to know about my own body. I met with Carol alone the following week, at my house, at my kitchen table, on my terms. I chose the kitchen table on purpose. It was the same table I'd been standing beside, folding laundry, the day Vanessa's hands landed on my stomach, and I wanted Carol to sit in that room and understand exactly what had happened there before either of us said a word. She arrived already talking, already explaining. She'd only wanted to protect the family, she said. She hadn't meant for it to go this far. She'd been planning to tell me eventually, once she found the right time, once she was sure I could handle it. I let her finish. I let her get all the way to the end of the explanation she'd clearly rehearsed in the car, and when she was done, I asked her one question, whether the right time would have come before or after I gave birth, not knowing my own risk. She didn't have an answer for that. For the first time since I'd known her, Carol didn't have an answer for anything. Then I told her the only thing that mattered, that I understood exactly why she'd done it, and that understanding why was not the same thing as forgiving it, and forgiving it was not the same thing as trusting her again with anything that belonged to me. She asked what that meant for the baby, for holidays, for the family she still wanted us to be. I told her the baby would know her as a grandmother who loved him, because that much, I believed, was true. But I would no longer be sharing anything with this family that I wasn't prepared to see repeated back to me by someone else. At a dinner, I wasn't invited to control. I told her that from now on, any information about my health, my pregnancy, or my daughter would come from me, on my timeline, and that if she ever heard something before I told her directly, she should assume it hadn't come from me at all, and treat it accordingly. She nodded. I don't know if she understood yet how permanent that line was. I think she does now. What followed wasn't dramatic. There was no lawsuit, though Priya had made clear the clinic would have supported one if I'd wanted it. Instead, there was a formal complaint against Renata that ended her employment at that facility, a quiet and permanent redrawing of the boundaries around what Carol was and wasn't told, and a long, careful conversation with Marcus about what it meant that he'd let 2 years of blame sit on my shoulders rather than push his own mother for an answer. He apologized in the specific, detailed way that told me he understood exactly what he was apologizing for, not the vague way people apologize when they just want the discomfort to end. I believed him. I also told him, plainly, that belief and second chances aren't interchangeable either, and that we would be doing the work of earning that back for longer than either of us would like. 8 months later, I gave birth to a daughter, in a hospital where I personally reviewed the visitor access list before I let anyone through the door. Carol came, briefly, on the second day, and held her granddaughter with the kind of careful tenderness that made it almost possible to forget what she'd done. Almost. I've learned that families don't have to be dismantled to be corrected. Sometimes they just have to be told, clearly and once, exactly where the new lines are. A year after that, I left my hospital compliance job and started a small consulting practice helping women, mostly during fertility treatment and pregnancy loss, understand and protect their own medical privacy, how to lock down portals, how to control who's listed as an authorized contact, how to read an access log if they ever suspect what I once suspected. It started as a favor for a friend of Priya's, a woman going through IVF whose own mother-in-law had somehow known her transfer date before she did, and it became, within a year, more work than I could do alone. I hired Priya part-time. We built a simple checklist that we now hand to every new client in their first week of treatment, long before anything goes wrong. Because I've learned that the best time to build a wall is before anyone's tried to climb it, not after. I built the practice, I think, because I never want another woman sitting on the edge of her own bathtub, holding a piece of paper that should have been entirely hers, wondering how many other people already know before she said a single word out loud. I think about that version of myself often, sitting on the edge of the tub, 34 years old, holding a positive test with hands that wouldn't quite stay still believing, in that moment, that the secret was mine to keep or share. It wasn't, not because I did anything wrong, but because somewhere in a system I understood better than anyone at that dinner table, a door had been left unlocked, and someone I trusted had walked through it before I had the chance to open it myself. Sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't making someone suffer. It's making sure they never get the chance to do it to anyone else. So that's my story. I still don't know if I'll ever fully trust Carol again, and some days I think that's all right. Trust isn't owed to anyone just because they share your last name. If you were watching this, tell me where you're watching from tonight, and tell me honestly, would you have confronted Carol the moment you found out, or would you have built the case first, the way I did? I'd love to know what you would have done in my place. If you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there's another one coming soon, and I promise you, it's even harder to see coming than this one was.